Troy Desmond Mercanti was born in 1967 into a successful Italian-Australian family in Perth. His father, Michael Mercanti, was a hardworking migrant who arrived in Australia from Italy in 1952 and slowly built a business empire from nothing. What began as a single shoe repair kiosk in Dianella Plaza in 1963 grew over the years into Mike's multi-service, a multi-million-dollar retail and wholesale operation with outlets scattered across Perth. Troy and his three brothers grew up in a household where money was stable, work was steady, and the future was secure. They were all expected to take part in the family business, learning how to run the counters, deal with customers, and eventually take over the growing enterprise. By all accounts, Troy had a comfortable life waiting for him if he wanted it. But comfort was never enough for Troy. Even as a teenager, he was drawn to the edge of society, to places where rules were bent and violence decided who mattered. While his brothers were learning how to expand the family business, Troy was spending more and more time around Bikies and street toughs, fascinated by their power, their loyalty, and the way fear followed them everywhere they went. To him, they looked free. Free from expectations, free from family obligations, and free from the quiet life he had been handed. By his early 20s, he had turned his back on the shoe empire entirely and committed himself to a different kind of family. That family was the Coffin Cheaters Motorcycle Club, one of Western Australia's oldest and most entrenched outlaw biker gangs. The Coffin Cheaters had a long and violent history, with chapters across Australia and a reputation for brutal enforcement of loyalty. Joining them was not just about riding motorcycles. It was about stepping into a world where betrayal could mean death, and where violence was a language spoken fluently by everyone involved. Troy did not just join, he rose quickly. Over the next decade, he built a reputation inside the club as a fierce and dependable enforcer, someone who could be trusted to handle problems without hesitation. To outsiders, he was just another Bikie. Inside the club, he was becoming something much more. For years, Troy stayed mostly out of the public eye, operating within the shadowy boundaries of the Bikie underworld. That changed dramatically in January 2005. 3 days before Australia Day, Troy walked into the basement of the Metro nightclub in Northbridge for what was supposed to be a meeting. Waiting for him was Nabil Debag, a member of the Scorpion Boys, another criminal outfit operating in Perth. The atmosphere was tense from the moment they came face to face. Whatever had brought them there, it was not going to end peacefully. In the cramped, dimly lit basement, words turned to threats, and threats turned into violence. Nabil moved first. He lunged at Troy with a knife, slashing and stabbing him across the neck and chest. Blood poured from Troy's wounds as the two men struggled for control. In that moment, with his life slipping away, Troy did what he had always done when cornered. He escalated. He pulled a gun and fired. 5 shots ripped into Nabil's body, stopping the attack in a burst of gunfire that echoed through the nightclub's underground walls. Somehow, both men survived. They were rushed to hospital, leaving behind a scene that would become legend in Perth's criminal circles. Police charged Troy with unlawful wounding for the shooting, and charged Nabil with causing grievous bodily harm for the knife attack. In court, the case turned into a brutal examination of who had acted in self-defense and who had gone too far. In the end, a jury acquitted both men. Legally, Troy walked free. But in the eyes of both police and the underworld, something had changed forever. He was no longer just a coffin cheater. He was a man who had survived a knife attack and responded by shooting another gangster 5 times in a nightclub basement. His name spread fast, and with it came a reputation for volatility that would follow him for the rest of his life. If 2005 made Troy notorious, the years that followed turned him into one of the most feared figures in Western Australia's Bikie scene. By 2007, the violence surrounding him had only intensified. In May of that year, Troy walked into the Geisha Bar in Northbridge, a popular nightlife spot. What happened next would leave a man permanently injured and would push Troy one step closer to open war. A confrontation erupted between Troy and a patron named Gregory F. Stonish. No one ever agreed on what exactly was said, but what everyone agreed on was how quickly it turned ugly. Troy threw a single punch, but it was devastating. Stonish collapsed unconscious, his jaw shattered by the blow. This time, there was no escaping the consequences. Troy claimed self-defense, but a jury did not believe him. He was convicted and later sentenced to 28 months in prison. For a moment, it looked like his reign of terror might finally be slowing down. But even before he went away for the geisha bar assault, another incident had already lit the fuse for something far worse. In Osborne Park, police found a senior Comanchero Bikie, Steve Shorty Milankovsky, bleeding heavily from the nose after being attacked. The Comancheros were one of the most powerful outlaw motorcycle clubs in Australia, with chapters across multiple states. Milankovsky had been beaten by Troy and one of his associates, but true to Bikie code, he refused to identify them. That silence did not mean forgiveness. It meant revenge. Less than 2 weeks later, the Coffin Cheaters Bassendean clubhouse was firebombed. A second building was soaked in fuel and set alight, destroying up to a dozen motorcycles and causing around $500,000 in damage. For the Coffin Cheaters, it was a declaration of war. Many of them did not even know why they had been targeted, but those close to Troy understood exactly what was happening. The Comancheros were sending a message, and Troy had written it with his fists. The retaliation was immediate. Hours after the firebombing, a fish and chip shop owned by Milankovsky's brother and Joe Keeney was torched. Flames, smoke, and fear spread through the suburb as the conflict spiraled out of control. What had begun as a single beating had now turned into a tit-for-tat campaign of arson and intimidation. Within weeks, the violence had crossed state lines. In Sydney, a peace meeting was arranged between senior Comancheros and Troy's associates from the Finks, another powerful Bikie gang. It was supposed to calm things down. Instead, it exploded. As the two sides met, gunfire erupted. Comancheros boss Mick Howie was forced to flee as bullets flew, and any hope of peace died in those moments. The failed sit-down locked both sides into a feud that would only grow more bitter and more violent. By early 2008, the conflict was so dangerous that the Perth-based street gang known as the Sword Boys stepped in to try to mediate. It was during these talks that a devastating truth came out. The Coffin Cheaters learned that Troy Mercanti had been secretly dealing with their enemies, the Comancheros. In the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs, this was unforgivable. Loyalty is everything, and Troy had crossed the one line that could not be crossed. He had betrayed his own club. The response was swift and brutal. In February 2008, Troy received a text message inviting him to a goat farm near Moore River. He was told it was to celebrate his 10-year anniversary with the Coffin Cheaters. For a man who had dedicated his life to the club, it sounded like an honor. Instead, it was a trap. When Troy arrived, he was ambushed by his own brothers. They beat him, stripped him of his colors, and took every piece of club insignia he owned. In Bikie culture, being expelled like this is worse than death. It marks you as a traitor, a man without protection in a world that shows no mercy. But Troy Mercanti was not a man who accepted humiliation quietly. What he would do next would ignite one of the bloodiest chapters in Western Australia's Bikie history. Being stripped of his colors on that goat farm was not just the end of Troy Mercanti's time with the Coffin Cheaters. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. In the outlaw biker world, there are only two ways to leave a club after a betrayal. You disappear quietly and live in fear, or you strike back and align yourself with the enemy. Troy chose the second path. Within months of his violent expulsion, he did the one thing the Coffin Cheaters feared most. He joined the Finks Motorcycle Club, one of their most bitter rivals, and helped establish a new Finks chapter in Perth. With him came loyalists, inside knowledge, and a level of organizational experience that instantly strengthened the Finks' position in Western Australia. To the Coffin Cheaters, this was a declaration of war. Troy was no longer just a former member. He was now a strategic threat, someone who understood their operations, their weaknesses, and their people. The bitterness between the two sides deepened even further when Troy's partner, Tammy Kingdom, became involved in an act that would be seen as one of the ultimate betrayals. Kingdom stole $54,000 from trust funds that had been set aside for the children of two deceased Coffin Cheaters members. That money was meant to support families who had lost their fathers. Instead, it was used to buy a rural property that became the new Finks clubhouse. When news of the theft spread, it was not just about money anymore. It was about honor, loyalty, and a line that could never be uncrossed. Tammy Kingdom was eventually charged over the theft, but by then the damage had already been done. To the Coffin Cheaters, the act symbolized everything Troy had become. He was no longer one of them. He was a man willing to take from the dead and their children to build his own empire. When Troy was summoned before an Australian Crime Commission examiner to answer questions about the stolen trust funds, he refused to cooperate. That silence earned him an additional 12 months in prison, on top of his sentence for the geisha bar assault. Even behind bars, his defiance was clear. He would not bend, no matter the cost. Outside prison walls, the war he had started continued to smolder. By 2009, both the Finks and the Coffin cheaters were locked in a cold conflict, with sporadic violence and constant tension. Everyone knew that it was only a matter of time before it erupted again. That moment came in October 2010 at the Quinana Motorplex, a venue hosting a daytime motorcycle drag racing event that had been advertised as family-friendly. Families and children were in attendance, unaware that some of the most dangerous Bickies in Western Australia were about to collide in the same place. Members of the Coffin cheaters and the Finks crossed paths in a public staging area where motorcycles were being prepared for racing. According to witnesses, it started with something small, almost insignificant. A Finks member spat toward a Coffin cheater. In the hyper-violent world of outlaw bikers, that was enough. Within seconds, the scene descended into chaos. Fists flew, knives were drawn, guns were pulled. Around 20 gang members were suddenly locked in a brutal brawl in front of shocked onlookers. One of Troy's closest allies in the Finks, David Marapodi, was shot in the leg. Another man, Stephen Wallace, a convicted heroin trafficker, had 3 fingers severed and suffered multiple stab wounds. A third man was seriously injured. Coffin cheaters members were also hurt, but, as always, none of them cooperated with police. To authorities, the Motorplex brawl was the violent peak of a war that had been building for years, a conflict that could be traced directly back to Troy Mercanti's betrayal and his decision to switch sides. Even though Troy himself was behind bars at the time, his influence was undeniable. The war was being fought in his name, driven by the alliances and enemies he had created. When he was released from prison in August 2011 for the geisha bar assault, many wondered if the violence would finally subside. For a short time, he kept a low profile, but it did not last. By February 2013, Troy was once again standing in a courtroom, this time facing some of the most serious accusations of his life. His former partner, Tammy Kingdom, the mother of his 2 sons, accused him of subjecting her to years of violent abuse. Their relationship had lasted 15 years, and according to her testimony, it was marked by control, intimidation, drug-fueled chaos, and repeated assaults that grew more severe over time. She told the court that she had endured it for the sake of their children, even visiting Troy twice a week during one of his earlier prison terms. Things, she said, became much worse after Troy was released just before Christmas in 2006. According to Kingdom, he returned home after days of disappearing, showing signs of intoxication and exhaustion. In their bedroom, she said, he began punching her in the head and body. When she tried to escape into the bathroom, he followed her and continued the assault. Later that same day during a family gathering, she said he intimidated her again and struck her so hard that one of her teeth was knocked out and 2 others were loosened. Hospital records later matched the injuries she described. Troy's defense tried to argue that her injuries were the result of accidents or intoxication, but her testimony was supported by a key witness, Troy's own mother. She told the court that she saw him strike Kingdom during the Christmas Day incident. That moment changed everything. 2 weeks into the trial, Troy abandoned his denials and pleaded guilty to 3 counts of assault and 1 count of causing grievous bodily harm. In March 2013, a judge sentenced him to 6 years and 10 months in prison, describing him as a man who exerted control through violence, threats, and degradation, and showing deep concern that even a restraining order might not be enough to protect Kingdom. After nearly 7 years behind bars, Troy Mercanti walked out of prison in January 2019 into a Western Australia that had changed dramatically while he was gone. The Bikie landscape was no longer what it had been in the days of the Coffin cheaters and the Finks. New laws had been introduced, police powers had expanded, and entire clubs had been reshaped or absorbed by larger international gangs. Troy was released under a strict post-sentence supervision order that was designed to keep him away from the world that had defined his life. He was banned from drinking alcohol, barred from entering most licensed venues, forbidden from contacting Tammy Kingdom, prohibited from associating with outlaw Bikies, and not allowed to possess weapons. On paper, it was meant to give him a chance at a different future. In reality, it was a ticking clock. While Troy was locked up, the Finks Motorcycle Club had been absorbed into the Mongols, an American-founded outlaw gang that was rapidly expanding across Australia. The Mongols brought with them a more aggressive, more organized approach to Bikie power, and their arrival shifted the balance of the entire underworld. When Troy was released, it was only a matter of time before he gravitated back to that orbit. Reports soon began to surface that he had joined the Mongols' Western Australian chapter, aligning himself with yet another powerful club despite the strict bans hanging over him. Police were watching closely. In February 2020, they launched a major operation against the Mongols, arresting 7 people and seizing drugs, weapons, cash, and other contraband. Troy was among those detained. He was accused of breaching his supervision order by associating with Bikies, a violation that carried serious consequences. Over the next few years, he would find himself back in court again and again, accused of similar breaches. Sometimes it was something as simple as shopping with a club associate. Other times it was being present at gatherings where Mongols members were in attendance. Troy often contested the allegations, but the courts repeatedly found that he had crossed the line. By 2023, the Western Australian government had introduced new anti-consorting laws aimed directly at outlaw motorcycle gangs. These laws made it illegal for Bikies to associate with each other or display club identifiers. Troy became the first person charged under the new regime. Police issued him with a dispersal notice listing 31 people he was not allowed to have any contact with. Instead of quietly complying, Troy openly defied the restrictions. He arrived at court wearing a shirt that mocked the Attorney General and branded the laws unconstitutional, turning his legal battles into public acts of protest. Despite his long history of convictions and conflicts with authorities, Troy also began to notch up unexpected legal wins. In 2024, South Australian police dropped charges against him and 2 associates for allegedly consorting at the Adelaide Fringe Festival. A magistrate found the claims baseless and ordered the state to pay their legal costs. To Troy and his supporters, it was proof that the system was overreaching. To police, it was a frustrating reminder that even the most notorious figures could still slip through the cracks. His notoriety surged again in May 2024 when he was arrested at his home in Corrigan following allegations of serious sexual assault. Police claimed the incident had occurred earlier that day at his mother's residence after a night out in Northbridge. Multiple charges were laid, and a second woman later came forward with a separate historical allegation. For a moment, it looked as though Troy was finally facing consequences that could put him away for a very long time. But within days, the case collapsed. The primary complainant withdrew her allegations, telling police she feared for her safety due to perceived threats from people associated with Troy. Prosecutors formally dropped the charges, though they left the door open to revisit the case if she chose to come forward again. Even without a conviction, the episode added yet another layer of controversy to a man whose public image was already stained by decades of violence and scandal. Then, in mid-2025, Troy Mercanti appeared in the headlines for a reason no one had predicted. At 58 years old, with a criminal record that had barred him from holding a combat sports license in Western Australia, he stepped into a boxing ring in Bangkok for his first professional fight. Denied the chance to compete at home, he had taken his ambitions overseas. After months of training and a strict weight loss regime, Troy faced Thai fighter Kitsana Bunosan at World Siam Stadium. 23 seconds into the first round, he knocked his opponent out cold. The win stunned onlookers and made international headlines, not just because of his age, but because of the strange transformation it represented. A man known for Bikie wars and domestic violence was suddenly being celebrated in a sporting arena. Supporters, including Mongols associates, praised his discipline and determination. Critics argued that he was simply using another high-profile platform to polish his reputation and distract from his past. Back in Perth, his legal troubles were far from over. He remained an active figure within the Mongols and was awaiting trial over an alleged fight at a pub involving another Bikie. He pleaded not guilty and was due to face court again in 2026. adding yet another unresolved chapter to a life that never seemed to slow down. Back in Perth, the Bikie world he had helped destabilize was still dealing with the consequences of his choices. The Coffin cheaters and the Finks War had permanently altered the balance of power among Western Australia's outlaw motorcycle gangs. Police, alarmed by how quickly personal vendettas could spiral into public chaos, had pushed for stronger anti-consorting laws. Those laws, controversial as they were written with people like Troy in mind. Men who could not be easily controlled, who carried influence even from behind prison walls, and who treated legal boundaries as just another challenge to overcome. Troy's repeated breaches of his post-sentence supervision orders were not just technical violations. They were statements. Each time he was caught with a Mongols associate, each time he wore club insignia or appeared at a gathering he was not supposed to attend, he was reminding authorities that he still belonged to the bikie world. The fines, the court appearances, and the public confrontations were part of a long, ongoing war between Troy and the system that had tried and largely failed to contain him. For Tammy Kingdom and her children, the story was far less abstract. Years after the guilty pleas and the prison sentence, the shadow of Troy's violence still hung over their lives. The court had described him as a man who exerted control through fear, threats, and degradation. And those words echoed long after he was released. Even as Troy chased new forms of fame through boxing and media attention, the damage he had left behind could not be undone. What made Troy Mercanti such a uniquely dangerous figure was not just his capacity for violence, but his ability to draw others into it. His betrayal of the Coffin cheaters did not end with his own expulsion. It ignited a conflict that spread across clubs, states, and years. The Motorplex brawl in 2010 was only the most visible flashpoint of a feud that had already cost lives, livelihoods, and millions of dollars in damage. Even from prison, Troy's name was enough to keep old enemies on edge and old allies ready for war. As he awaits his next trial, Troy remains a reminder of how deeply the Bikie underworld is woven into the fabric of Western Australia's criminal history. It is a world where loyalty is currency, betrayal is punished without mercy, and men like Troy can rise and fall without ever truly leaving the battlefield. His story is not one of redemption. It is a warning about what happens when power, pride, and violence collide in a society that struggles to contain them. From a family business heir to a feared enforcer, from a disgraced traitor to a Mongols affiliate, and finally to a late-life boxer chasing headlines, Troy Mercanti's journey reflects the brutal contradictions of the outlaw motorcycle gang world. It is a place where identity is forged through conflict, and where the past never really lets go. For all the court cases, prison sentences, and public scandals, Troy remains exactly what he has always been. A man shaped by the violence he chose, still moving forward through the wreckage he helped create. Subscribe to Complete Crime for more true stories from the dark side of the underworld.